even mentioned the horrendous injustice which all this comprises, and yet he insisted we pay it. He never even gave the math, how it is possible to pay it. He and Barbara Walters just shook their heads at the question how this might be possible. They had no math, and they contemplated to do a thing which therefore is an incomprehensible further crime against us. Yet he spoke merely about an unlawful betrayal of just federal debt, as if paying artificial costs we could never survive would fix anything, subject to an ever unjustified, unassented system which can only multiply artificial indebtedness further. And what about private debt then? If deprived of this final means of artificial sustention, and we ourselves cannot afford any longer to maintain a vital circulation by borrowing further, where are we? What consequence will we suffer now at the hand of our betrayers but immediate failure? And all this to pay just federal debt to a falsified creditor we don't even owe the debt to? Ostensibly to preserve the very terminal system of stealing from us, that it can finally manifest in our complete dispossession? No wonder the Obama administration returned my proposition of mathematically perfected economy without even opening it. But that only means they knew then. They knew, and so they proceed with a coup de grace, knowingly and wrongly. So, converse to this fatal obfuscation of the currency, mathematically perfected economy is not only the singular solution to the categoric faults of the phenomenal lie we call economy. Mathematically perfected economy is every person's right to issue or to give up property for legitimate, enforceable, promissory contracts, free of extrinsic manipulation, adulteration, or exploitation of the obligation, or the natural opportunity to make good on them. So let's formally summarize these things. I'm going to give 5 points and various subpoints in response to this first statement. There is no mystery why pretended economists never teach the few actual principles of monetization to the unwitting victim class. 1. That whoever contracts to fulfill a debt is ultimately the issuer of their promissory obligation, for the obligation is theirs and would never even otherwise exist but for their willful commitment to fulfillment. 2. That the only actual creditors give up the property which is acquired for these obligations, with any risk of the integrity of the resultant currency eliminated only by enforcement of a just and universally enforceable contract, whereas it is mathematically impossible to universally enforce falsified obligations to pay principal and interest out of a circulation which is forever comprised, at most, of only some remaining principal, nor is interest justified to a pretended creditor who no more than publishes evidence of our promissory obligations to each other, falsely claiming not only a groundless debt to a mere publisher of this evidence of a very different obligation, which does not even involve the publisher, but that risk justifies paying interest to this mere publisher, which obfuscates the original obligation into a falsified debt to itself, when the actual cost, risk, and represented possession of the mere publisher are no more than the negligible costs of publication. 3. That as the real creditor receives full payment from the outset of every such arrangement, therefore no justifiable claim to interest exists. In fact, likewise, these purposed obfuscations of the pretended economies which have been imposed upon the world deny every actual creditor interest. That only principal and the costs of enforcement, if any, therefore are rightly paid by debtors. That all payment of principal must be retired from circulation, for the fact of fulfillment cancels the obligation from existence. That paid principal, therefore, is the rightful property of no one, much less is it the property of mere intervening publishers of our promissory obligations to each other, who only claim to issue credit. And finally, the principal must be paid at the rate of consumption or depreciation of the related property, for no other rate of payment and no other conditions solve inflation and deflation. No other fact likewise preserves the debtor's right to pay only for what they consume as they consume of it. And nothing but these inseparable objects will perpetually sustain redeemability and relative value in a circulation which, even without any need for regulation, by no more than this one justifiable natural pattern of payment, will perpetually maintain a 1-to-1-to-1 relationship between remaining circulation, remaining obligation, and remaining value of perpetually represented property, furthermore ensuring that the natural obligations are always enforceable in remaining value. 4. That this alone is economy, because this one natural and factual pattern alone eliminates all extrinsic or redundant cost. That we can perpetually sustain industry in which we acquire others' production for no more than equal measures of our own. And 5, that this will be possible only when the unwitting victim class finally rises above the pathological lies of banking, which therefore is no more than purposed terminal exploitation, even as banking and its artifact of ever-escalated artificial costliness comprise the present terminal lie of economy. Of course they don't teach us these things, but they're the only truth. Anyone who takes the side of the lie or any other imperfect permutation, either by disinterest or vested interest, compromises principles which condemn humanity to the course of the lie, so long as the lie is given leeway to prevail. We can only consciously partake in the lie's improprieties because its entirety is impropriety. Absolutely no one, therefore, can know it for anything else, and so its advocates are condemned to unqualifiable assertion and evasion, which, even as a manner of establishing purported fact, itself always gives away the conscious promotion of wrong. As the lie is spun about the deception it is, it predicates a course to inevitable failure in which each first generation to live under each finite lifespan of the lie certainly can prosper relatively more, at first at least, if only by the seeming grace of a far lower initial toll of falsified debt. Yet how can we but wrongly presume this validates the lie, even as this generation's deserved prosperity is itself so increasingly compromised by acquiescence to the falsifications? that ever more so it is as much as forced to sell its compromised possession for many unjust prices, so escalating the purposed processes of the lie at criminal expense to its own progeny, that should it survive to see the end of that instance of the lie, the generation of initial artificial indebtedness inevitably can only pretend a false prosperity over its exceeding negation by passing its own far greater share of fatal artificial debt to its own children, criminally denying them to the extent of no more than their own unattended, falsified negative worth, unless that generation finally instead chooses with its children to revert the lie and its ever-escalated dispossession of all, that finally all generations may instead simply retain their deserved wealth. As the crime can only be preserved by destroying every potential avenue for actual representation, likewise then, pretended representation forever requires every shill whom usury can buy to sell their own people not only to involuntary servitude, but to the destruction of practically every principle the authors of liberty ever held dear. To consciously partake in the impropriety, therefore, condemns every perpetrator to deception and evasion, for no real justification can exist to qualify claims to injustice. All this is crime. It is even self-destructive crime, but it is crime and crime alone, and a crime which inherently, to persist, must destroy the most vital instruments of every free nation. Partakers in the lie regularly presume a separate right to undeserved reward above a person's actual contribution to the pool of wealth. This mere presumed right, however, can only come at the expense of the universal right to just reward, because by siphoning from a pool of wealth equal only to production, it denies every producer just reward equivalent to their production. Pandering to an audience, they consciously deny justice, therefore, and rationalizing participation to themselves. Participants in the lie conspicuously, regularly, and therefore consciously avoid all comprehensive discussion of the nature and ramifications of monetization, as if the whole lie were already justified by truths we most particularly will never hear from them, because every extension of actual fact versus mere purported fact exposes not only their betrayal, their price, and the whole vast injustice of the lie, but its irreversible escalation of inevitably terminal dispossession. So intentionally unjust, in fact, is the whole lie, and so inherently criminal, therefore, is the betrayal, that every purported economy subject to its falsified claims to interest inevitably terminates itself under fatal sums of artificial debt. Pretended economy, therefore, cannot be saved from itself, because the lie is inherently terminal. Actual economy, on the other hand, suffers none of the lie's inevitable destruction, explicitly because its singular justice is perpetual. Under absolute economy, as we would in nature, we would produce no more than a house to own a house. To do so, we might issue a promissory obligation to an actual creditor who gives up the house for our promissory obligation. in which case the creditor is paid in full in spendable currency from the outset, and the integrity of the currency will be sustained